I've been running the aid station at Little Creek for 19 years. 19 years of taped ankles and stress fractures and kids who cried when I told them they were done. I've seen men beg me, actually beg, hands on my desk, eyes red, to sign a paper saying they were fine when they weren't. I've had a chief petty officer offer me his father's watch. So when I tell you I have never in my life seen a room go as quiet as it did that Tuesday morning in March, I want you to understand what that means coming from me. It wasn't the shouting that did it. It was what she took off. My name is Denise Carlo, hospital corpsman, retired, then civilian medical staff, which is a fancy way of saying I never actually left. I just changed the color of my badge and started getting paid slightly better. Little Creek in March is a gray, wet, miserable place. The wind comes off the Chesapeake and it doesn't blow so much as it leans on you. Rain that isn't rain, it's more like the air is just wet and it stays wet, and it gets under your collar and into your boots and it lives there. The grass on the PT field turns to soup. You can smell the bay from anywhere on the compound, this cold iodine smell, salt and old rope and diesel. That year we were running what the command called an integration assessment. What it actually was, a pipeline, a pre-selection course. Bodies from all over, Marines, Army, a couple of Air Force pararescue candidates, Navy folks, a handful of foreign liaisons, all funneled into an 8-week grinder to see who could hang before anybody spent real money on them. 81 people started that cycle. She was one of 9 women. Her name was Raina Solvig. I want to be careful how I describe her, because if I'm not careful I'll make her sound like something out of a movie, and she wasn't. That's the whole point. She wasn't. She was maybe 5'7", not tall, not short. Brown hair she kept in the tightest bun I'd ever seen, like she'd punished it into place. Face that didn't do much. Not cold exactly, just settled, like a lake with no wind on it. She was 34 years old, and in that room, that made her old. Most of these kids were 23, 24. They had the shoulders and the jawlines and the aggressive haircuts and the way of standing that says, "Look at me. I'm about to do something incredible." Raina stood like a woman waiting for a bus. She didn't talk much. First week, I don't think I heard her say 10 words. She'd come through the aid station line for the mandatory and processing screen, and she answered every question with the shortest possible answer. Any prior injuries? Some. Care to be specific? And she'd looked at me, just looked. Not rude, not defiant, something else. Something almost apologetic. Old ones, she'd said, healed. And I'd written neg in the box because that's what people write. And I moved on to the next kid. I think about that a lot now, that box, that word, neg. I think about it more than I should. Here's what you need to understand about the man. Colonel Everett Boyd Marchetti, Marine, 48 years old at the time. He was not a SEAL, though half the candidates thought he was, and he never once corrected them, and I've always felt that was intentional. He was the command element for the assessment, the guy who ran the pipeline, decided who stayed, who went home, whose file got a red mark that would follow them the rest of their career. He had this way of walking, chin slightly up, hands loose, like he'd already decided about you before he got close enough to see your name tape. I want to be fair to him. I really do. Because I've had 5 years to think about this, and I've come out the other side thinking he wasn't evil. He was something more common and, honestly, more dangerous. He was a man who had built his entire life on one idea, and the idea was this: pain is a test, and the people who complain about pain are the people who fail it. That idea had served him well. It had kept him alive. It had carried him through his own selection 20-something years back, and through 3 deployments where I'm sure he did things I'll never know about. He had a scar down the back of his neck he never talked about, and he limped in cold weather, and he never ever mentioned it. So he'd earned the idea. But he'd made it into a religion, and people who make things into religion stop being able to see the exceptions. Week 3. That's when it started. We were 3 weeks into 8 and the class was down to 52. That's normal. The first cut is always the biggest. That's the guys who thought they wanted this and found out on day 9, chest deep in the surf at 4 in the morning with their arms locked with a stranger's, that they didn't. Raina was still standing. More than standing, actually. She was in the top third on everything. She wasn't the fastest runner, wasn't the strongest swimmer, but there's a metric they don't write down and everybody in the business knows it, and it's this. How does she look at hour 14? Some people are beautiful at hour 1 and they fall apart at hour 10. Some people are ugly the whole way and they just don't stop. Raina was ugly the whole way. Her form was bad. Her breathing was worse. She looked at all times like a woman being slowly dragged behind a truck. And she never stopped. The instructors noticed. I heard 2 of them talking outside the aid station one afternoon. A senior chief named Doak and a Marine gunny whose name I never learned. And Doak said something I've never forgotten. He said, "She's not fast, she's just unquittable." The gunny laughed, Doak didn't. The trouble started with a rope. They ran an obstacle course out past the seawall, old, ugly, half of it rotted, the kind of thing that gets rebuilt every 4 years and is never actually safe. There was a rope climb at Station 7, 22 feet, thick manila, wet from the rain. Raina went up it like everybody else, made it to the top, slapped the beam, came down. And when she hit the ground, her right leg buckled. Not dramatically, she didn't fall. She just dipped, like the floor moved under her, and she caught herself and she took a second and she ran on. Marchetti saw it. He was standing about 40 feet away with a clipboard and a coffee, and he saw it, and I watched his face do something I didn't like. He didn't say anything then. He waited 11 days. That's the part I want you to sit with for a second, because it tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He didn't confront her at the rope. He didn't pull her aside and ask if she was okay. He didn't come to me, the medical officer standing right there, whose actual job it was to evaluate exactly that, and say, "Hey, Carlo, take a look at candidate Solvig." He filed it away. He put it in a drawer in his head, and he closed the drawer, and he waited for the right moment to open it. Because he didn't want to help her, he wanted to prove something. Day 31, a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because Tuesdays were long-run days, and long-run days meant I'd be in the aid station until 9 at night dealing with what long runs due to people who have already been broken for a month. The rain that morning was the horizontal kind. You could see it moving across the field in sheets, like something walking. Raina didn't show up for the run. She showed up at the aid station instead, at 4:55, before the run formed up. She was in her PT gear, soaked already, and she stood in my doorway and she said the 4 words I'd heard maybe 10,000 times in 19 years. "I need a chit." A chit, medical paperwork, permission to sit out. I looked at her. She was pale, not tired pale, something else. "For what?" I said. And she said, "My leg." And I said, "Because I am a good corpsman and this is my job. Sit down, let me look." And she said, "And this is the thing, this is the thing. I'd rather you didn't. I want to be honest with you about my own part in this, because if I only tell you the part where I was right, this whole story is worthless." I got annoyed. I got annoyed with her. 19 years of people trying to game me, and here's this woman, top third of her class, asking me to write her out of a run without letting me examine her, and something in my gut went, here it is. Here's the crack, because I'd been waiting for her crack, honestly. Everybody has one. I'd been waiting for Raina Solvig's, and I thought I'd just found it, and some ugly little part of me was satisfied. I said, "Then I can't help you." She stood there for a long moment, water running out of her hair, down her jaw, dripping off her chin onto my floor. Then she said very quietly, "Okay." And she turned around and went out into the rain and ran the 12 miles. She finished 43rd out of 48. She had never finished worse than 19th. And when she came in, and I was standing at the finish line, because that's where I'm supposed to be, she wasn't running anymore. She was doing something that had run in its family somewhere but had gotten a long way from home. Her right leg was swinging out sideways, wide, like a gate on a bad hinge. And Marchetti was there. He had his coffee. He always had a coffee. He waited for her to cross. He let her cross. He let her put her hands on her knees and drag air in. Then he opened his drawer. Solvig. She straightened up. Sir, you asked for a chit this morning. I felt my stomach go cold because I hadn't told him that, which meant he'd asked. He'd gone and asked. He'd been checking. Yes, sir. Denied. I withdrew the request, sir. He took a sip of coffee. 50 people are standing around now. The whole class, what's left of it, soaked and steaming and starring. Why'd you ask? And she said, my leg was bothering me, sir. Bothering. I want you to hear the way she said it because she wasn't whining. She wasn't performing. She used the smallest word she could find. She minimized it. And Marchetti smiled. Your leg, he said, was bothering you. Yes, sir. He turned, not to her, to them, to the class. 50 exhausted kids standing in the rain, and he turned to face them like a man about to teach a lesson. And I knew, and I opened my mouth and nothing came out. Gentlemen, he said, and ladies, I want to talk to you about the word bothering. Nobody moved. Because in about 4 months, some of you, a few of you, are going to be somewhere very unpleasant, and you're going to have a decision to make. And that decision is going to sound a lot like, does this bother me enough to stop? He walked down the line, slow. And I'll tell you what the answer is. The answer is that the enemy does not care what bothers you. The mission does not care what bothers you. The 17-year-old kid bleeding out 40 meters from your position does not care that your leg is bothering you. He stopped, he came back, he stood in front of her. Candidate Solvig came to medical this morning at 04:55 to ask for a piece of paper that would excuse her from a run. Not a firefight, not a night dive, a run, on flat ground, in the rain. And she stood there. She stood there and she took it, and her face did nothing. Now, he said, I'm a fair man, so I'm going to give you a chance to explain it, in front of your peers, because they're the ones who are going to have to trust you. He spread his hands. Tell them about your leg. The rain was coming down. I could hear it on the metal roof of the equipment shed behind us, this endless hollow drumming. Somebody down the line coughed. A gull screamed out over the water, and it sounded, I swear to God, like laughing. Raina Solvig looked at him. And then she looked past him, at the class, at the 50 kids, at me. And I watched her make a decision. I've thought about that half-second more than any half-second of my life, because I know now what was going through her head. I know now exactly what she was weighing. She was deciding whether to let him win. And you have to understand, letting him win would have been easy. She could have said, no excuse, sir. 3 words. He'd have nodded and moved on, and she'd have kept her secret and finished the course, and nobody would ever have known. That was the smart play. That was the safe play. But there were 50 kids standing in the rain being taught, right then, in real time, that asking for help is weakness. That's the lesson he was writing on them. And some of those kids were going to carry that lesson for 20 years, and some of them were going to die of it, quietly, in a hospital in Bethesda, from something that could have been caught if they just walked into a room and said, this hurts. She wasn't deciding whether to defend herself. She was deciding whether to save them. Sir, she said, do you want me to explain it, or do you want me to show you? And Marchetti, God help him, Marchetti laughed. He actually laughed. By all means, he said, show me. She bent down. She untied her right boot. And I want to tell you that I understood what was happening, but I didn't. Not yet. I thought I don't know what I thought. Blister, swelling, something. She pulled the boot off. Then the sock. And she rolled her PT pant leg up. Slowly. Past the ankle. Past the shin. Past the knee. 50 people stopped breathing at the same time. I've never heard anything like it. It wasn't a gasp. It was the absence of a sound. 50 sets of lungs just stopping. Her right leg, from the ankle to about 4 inches above the knee, was not a leg. I mean, it was a leg, but it was a leg the way a bombed-out church is still a church. The skin was a topographic map of somewhere terrible. Scar tissue and raised white ropes, crossing and recrossing, some of it silvery and old and some of it still pink and angry. Divots, actual craters where flesh had been taken and never came back. The calf muscle on the outside was simply gone, scooped out, leaving a hollow you could have set a coffee mug in. And the marks, the little marks. Dozens of them, scattered across the whole thing like someone had thrown a handful of gravel at her leg at 400 miles an hour. Because someone had. I'm a medical professional. I have been for 24 years, and I stood there in the rain and I could not make my brain work. Because I knew what I was looking at. Everybody who's been near a war knows what that looks like. Those little marks aren't cuts. Cuts are lines. Those were entries. Every one of those little puckered dots was a place where something metal, something moving faster than sound, had gone in. That's shrapnel. That's not shrapnel scarring. That's shrapnel. Still in there. Marchetti wasn't laughing anymore. He was standing very, very still, and the coffee in his hand had tilted, and it was running out over the rim and down onto his boot, and he had not noticed. Rena Solvig straightened up. She stood there on one bare foot in 3 inches of freezing mud, in the rain, with 50 people staring at her leg, and she looked at the colonel, and her face still did nothing. It just didn't move. And she said, "It's still in there, sir. 29 pieces. The surgeon at Landstuhl got out about 40. The rest were too close to the artery. They said if they'd gone after them, I'd have lost the leg." She said it the way you'd read a grocery list. "They migrate. When it's cold or when I load it too hard, they move. Not far, a millimeter, too." She looked down at her own leg. "The one that bothered me this morning is right here." She touched a spot on the outside of her knee, very gently, almost tenderly. "It's been working its way toward the surface for about 6 months. When it presses on the perineal nerve, my foot doesn't lift." She looked back up at him. "That's why my leg swings out when I run, sir. It's not form, it's not conditioning. The foot doesn't lift." Nobody said a word. Somewhere behind me a kid, I think it was a Marine Lance Corporal named Prout, 22 years old, all shoulders and swagger, made a small sound. Not a word, just a sound, like something in his chest had come loose. Marchetti said, "You ran 12 miles. "Yes, sir." "This morning." "Yes, sir." "On that." And she said, and this is the line, this is the one that I still hear at 2 in the morning sometimes. "I've run further on worse. Here's what happens after a moment like that." Nothing. That's the part nobody tells you. In the movies there's a swell of music and somebody says something and the world reorganizes itself. In real life, 50 exhausted people stand in the rain and nobody knows what to do with their hands. Marchetti stood there for about 4 seconds, I counted. I don't know why I counted, and then he said, "Class is dismissed, chow at 11:30. And he turned around and walked away. That's it, that's all he said. He didn't apologize. He didn't order her to medical. He didn't say stand down or you're excused or why the hell didn't you tell me. He just dismissed the class and he walked back toward the admin building with his ruined coffee and his straight back, and he never once looked over his shoulder. I hated him for that. For a long time, I hated him for that specific thing more than for any of the rest of it. It took me years to understand it wasn't cruelty. It was that he had absolutely no idea what to say, and he had never in his life been in a room where he didn't know what to say, and the only tool he had for that situation was leave. The class didn't move. 50 people standing in the mud, and their commanding officer had walked off, and there was a woman with a bare foot in the freezing muck holding her pant leg up around her thigh. And Raina, this is the part that gets me, Raina reached down and unrolled the pant leg and got her sock and sat down, right there, in the mud. She sat down in the mud and started putting her boot back on. Like nothing had happened. Like she'd stopped to tie a lace. And I finally, my legs worked, and I went to her, and I got down on my knees in the mud next to her, and I put my hand on her arm and I said, "Stop." She didn't look at me. She said, "It's fine, HM." "It is not fine. You are coming with me right now." And she said, still not looking at me, still working the boot on over that foot, "If I go with you, I'm out of the course." And there it was. That was the whole thing. That was the answer to every question I'd had for 31 days. Why won't she let me examine her? Because the second I put hands on that leg, I would have to write it down. And the second I wrote it down, a doctor would look at it, and the doctor would say what any doctor would say, which is that a human being with 29 pieces of foreign metal in their lower leg has no business in a special operations pipeline, and she'd be gone. Not just from the course, from everything. Med board, permanent limited duty, a desk, a lanyard, and a slow 20 years of watching other people do the job. She hadn't been hiding an injury. She'd been hiding a life. Prout got there before I could stop him. The lance corporal, 22, shoulders like a door, that particular kind of young man who has never in his life had a thought he didn't say out loud. He crouched down in front of her, in the mud, and he said, "Ma'am, where?" She looked up. He said it again, and his voice cracked, which for a Marine lance corporal in front of 49 of his peers is a form of public death. Where'd you get it?" And Raina Solvig looked at this kid, this enormous, terrified child, and something in her face finally moved. Just a little, around the eyes. And she said, "Not here." She stood up. She got her boot laced. She got up out of the mud. She rolled her shoulders back. And then she said to all of them, because they were all still standing there, all 50, not one of them had gone to chow. "Formations at 1300. Don't be late because of me." And she walked off toward the barracks. Limping. She didn't hide it anymore. That's the thing I noticed. For 31 days she'd been managing that limp. I could see it now, looking back, all the little tricks, the way she'd shorten her stride on the right, the way she'd take stairs one at a time when she thought nobody was watching. All that work. All that constant, exhausting performance of being fine. She stopped doing it that afternoon. She just walked, bad leg swinging out wide, foot slapping the wet concrete, all the way across the compound. And nobody laughed. I want to talk about the barracks that night because I wasn't there, and everything I know about it I got secondhand from Prout, 4 years later, in a bar in Jacksonville when he was drunk and I was not. Here's what he told me. Nobody talked. That's what he kept saying. He said it 3 or 4 times. Nobody talked, Doc, 50 of us. Nobody talked. He said normally that barracks at night was a zoo, trash talk, cards, somebody's terrible speaker playing somebody's terrible music, the constant background noise of 50 young people burning off cortisol. That night it was a library. He said guys were lying in their racks staring at the ceiling. He said Kessler, a ranger, a real hard case, guy who'd been openly saying since week 1 that women shouldn't be in the pipeline. He said Kessler sat on the edge of his rack for 2 hours and didn't move. And he said around 2300, somebody down the far end, he never knew who, said out loud to nobody, I've been telling myself my shoulder's fine for 6 weeks. And nobody answered him. But Prout said about 10 seconds later, somebody else said, "Ribs." And then somebody said, "Knee." And it went around, quietly, in the dark, 50 exhausted kids in a dark room saying, one at a time, the thing they'd been hiding. Prout said he didn't say anything. He said he cried instead, quietly, with his forearm over his eyes. And he was 22 years old, and he'd never done that in his life. Now, Marchetti, I know what happened in the admin building that night because I was in the admin building that night. Because at 1900, I went to his office to file a formal medical objection to candidate Solveig's continued participation, which was the correct procedure, which was my job, and which I want you to understand I was going to do whether she forgave me for it or not. I never filed it. I'll tell you why. The lights in that building are fluorescent, and one of them on the second floor had been buzzing and flickering for as long as I'd worked there. Nobody ever fixed it. It made a sound like an insect dying very slowly. His door was open about 4 inches. I was going to knock. I had my hand up. And I heard him say to no one, because there was nobody in there, he was alone. No. Just that, just no. Flat, like an argument he was losing. I looked through the gap. He was sitting at his desk with a folder open in front of him. Not a candidate file. Candidate files at Little Creek are manila, standard issue. We go through 600 a year. This was something else. Gray cardstock. A red diagonal stripe across the corner. The kind of thing that comes out of a safe and goes back into a safe and gets signed for both times. And he was sitting there with both hands flat on the desk on either side of it, and he was staring down at it, and he was not moving. I stood there for a long time, long enough to feel like a coward. Then I knocked. He didn't jump, he didn't close it, he just said, "Come." I went in. He looked up at me and his face was, I've never seen a man look like that. Not grief, not shame, something more like vertigo, like he'd stood up too fast and the room hadn't caught up yet. He said, "Carlo." "Sir." "Sit down." I sat. He looked at the folder, he looked at me, and he said something I did not expect at all. He said, "Do you know how many people are cleared to read this?" "No, sir." 9, he tapped it. Once. 9 people in the Department of Defense, and as of about 4 hours ago, I am one of them because I called a man I have not spoken to in 11 years, and I asked him a favor I had no right to ask. He turned the folder around, slid it across the desk. He said, "You're not one of the 9. Then he took his hand off it and sat back. I want to be precise here, because this is the part where I could very easily make myself sound better than I was. I did not want to read it. I sat there and looked at that gray folder, and every instinct I had said don't. Because I knew, the way you know a thing in your stomach before your brain catches up, that reading it would put something in me that I would not be able to get back out. I read it anyway. Most of it was black. I don't mean redacted in the neat way you see on the news, where there's a paragraph and one name is blocked out. I mean the pages were black, solid, whole sections, whole pages where the only thing not blacked out was the page number at the bottom, sitting there at the base of all that darkness like a headstone. There was a date, 11 FEB. The year was blacked out. There was a location, blacked out. There was a unit designation, blacked out. There was a line that said personnel recovery, non-permissive, and then 11 blacked out lines under it. And then on page 4 near the bottom, there was a paragraph that had somehow, through some clerical accident, some tired clerk at some point deciding it didn't matter, survived. I read it 3 times. Then I put my hand over my mouth, and I sat in that fluorescent buzzing office, and I did not cry, because I was raised by a Marine and I had 19 years of practice. But it was close. Marchetti said, very quietly. Ambulatory. I didn't answer. He said, do you understand what that word means in that sentence? In that sentence. Yes, sir. It means she walked. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the wall. It means she took the medal and she took the hours and she did not go quiet, and then she got up and she walked to the aircraft. And she told a man with a stretcher he stopped. He had to. She told a man with a stretcher no thank you. He put his hand over his eyes. And this morning, he said, I told her that the mission doesn't care what bothers her. I have never seen a colonel cry, and I did not see one that night either. He didn't cry. He sat there with his hand over his eyes for maybe 20 seconds, and then he took it away, and his face was completely normal and completely dead. And he said, "Get out." And I said, "Sir." And he said, not loudly, without any heat at all, "Carlo, please get out of my office." So I did. I went back to the aid station, and I sat in the dark and I thought about the box. The box on the in-processing form, any prior injuries. And her looking at me. That look I'd read as evasive. And then me, 24 years a medical professional, 19 years at that command, writing neg and sliding the form onto the pile and calling the next name. She hadn't lied to me. She said she said old ones, every word she said was true. I just hadn't asked the second question. There's a thing that happens to medical people. It's not laziness. It's worse than laziness because it looks like competence. You see 600 people a year. 600 kids who all want the same thing and all lie about the same things in the same ways. And after a while, you stop listening. You start pattern matching. You hear the first 4 words and you know where it's going, and you're right 98 times out of 100, and being right 98 times out of 100 is what makes you good at the job. And then somebody walks in who is the 2. And you look right at them, and you see the 98. That's what I did. That's exactly what I did. Marchetti humiliated her in front of 50 people, and I will never forgive him for it. But I have to tell you the truth. And the truth is that I did something quieter, and I'm not sure it was better. He didn't see her. I didn't look. The next morning was Wednesday. Wednesdays were pool. And I want you to understand that this was the day it should have ended. This was the day where, in any sane and functional world, Colonel Marchetti walks into that pool house, dismisses the class, pulls candidate Solvig aside, and says, "You're done. And it's an honor to have met you, and here's my number. Call me if you ever need anything for the rest of your life." That is not what happened. What happened was that at 5:30, Colonel Everett Marchetti walked into the pool house in a swimsuit. His own. He was 48 years old. He had a scar down the back of his neck. He had a body that had been extremely impressive 20 years ago and was now just a body. A hard, used, 48-year-old body with a gut he was clearly not happy about. And 50 candidates stopped dead on the deck and stared at him. He walked to the edge. He did not look at Raina, he looked at the water. And he said, "Weight belts." Somebody, I think it was Kessler, the ranger, said, "Sir." Marchetti said, without turning around, "You heard me, everyone, belts on, including me." He put on a weight belt. A 48-year-old colonel with a rebuilt neck put on a 20-pound weight belt and stood on the edge of a pool with 50 candidates. And I stood in the doorway with my medical bag and my heart going like a bird in a box, because I have seen exactly this kind of thing before, and it has never, not once, ended well. And then he said the thing. He turned around, and he found her, and he looked right at her, and 50 heads turned to follow, and he said, "Solvig, you're not doing this evolution." She started to speak. He held up a hand. "That's not a medical hold. That is not a chit. Your record is untouched. You will graduate with this class if you earn it." He looked at the water again. You're not doing it because you already did it. 11 February. 50 people did not know what that meant. She did. I watched her face, and for the first time in 32 days, I watched Raina Solvig's face come apart. Not much, not a lot. Her chin moved, that's all. Her chin moved about a quarter inch and her eyes went bright and she looked at the floor. And Marchetti said, "You're going to stand on that deck and you're going to watch us. And if any of us goes under and doesn't come up, you're going to do what you do." He put his hand on the belt buckle. "Because apparently," he said, "that's what you do." And he stepped off the edge. The pool house at Little Creek smells like chlorine and old rubber and something underneath that I've never been able to name. Mildew, maybe, or fear. I've been in that building 1,000 times and I've never once liked it. It's got a ceiling like an aircraft hangar, and the light comes in through these high dirty windows in long gray bars, and the water throws it back up onto the walls in these moving ripples, so the whole room is always shifting slightly, like being inside something's stomach. 51 people went into the water that morning. 50 came out on their own. Let me tell you what the evolution actually was, because if I don't, none of this makes sense. It's called weight belt swim, and the version they ran that day is a variant they don't use anymore, and I have my own opinions about why. You put on 20 pounds, you get in the deep end 11 feet at Little Creek, and you swim laps, not on the surface. Along the bottom, you push off, you go, you come up when you have to, you go back down. The belt does something to your head, because you're not floating. If you stop moving, you sink. And there's a lag, a second, maybe two, between deciding to go up and actually going up. And in that second, 20 pounds is a very heavy thing and 11 feet is a very long way. Most people fail it in their heads, not their lungs. Marchetti went first. I'll give him this, he could still swim. 48 years old, 20 extra pounds around the middle, and he went into that water and he moved. Not fast, but smooth and low, and with a kind of grim economy that told you he'd done 10,000 of these. The class went in behind him, and Raina Solvig stood on the deck. She didn't argue. That surprised me. I expected her to fight it. I'd have bet money she'd have gotten in that water with a belt and 29 pieces of metal in her leg just to prove she could. She didn't. She just took her place at the edge of the deck, about a third of the way down the long side, and she put her hands behind her back, and she watched. And I realized, slowly, over the next 10 minutes, that she wasn't watching the way I was watching. I was watching the water. She was watching faces. Every time a head came up, her eyes went to it, just for a fraction of a second, then to the next one, then the next. She was running a count. She was running a count in her head of 50 people in a churning pool, and I could see her lips move very slightly, and I understood that she was doing something I had been trained to do for 24 years and had never once done as well as she was doing it right then. She was triaging. Not injured people, not yet injured people. She was watching for the one who was about to be in trouble. Here's what I noticed at about minute 12. There was a kid at the far end, Air Force, pararescue candidate, a PJ hopeful name of Toma Wexler, little guy, maybe 5'6", 140 pounds soaking wet, which in that pool he was. He was one of the best swimmers in the class, genuinely. Water was his whole thing. He'd been beating Navy guys in the pool since week 1 and being extremely polite about it, which somehow made it worse. And I watched him come up and go down and come up and go down. And nothing was wrong. He looked good. He looked great. He was one of the strongest people in that pool and he was fine. And Raina Solvig had stopped scanning. She was looking at him. Only at him. I want to be very clear about the timeline here, because people have gotten it wrong. She started watching him at approximately minute 12. He went under and did not come up at minute 19. 7 minutes. She watched that kid for 7 minutes before anything happened. 7 minutes, in a pool with 50 people thrashing in it, at a range of about 40 feet, through churned water from the deck, and she knew. I asked her about it, later, much later, and I'll get to that. I said, "What did you see?" And she said, and she was almost embarrassed. She said it like she was confessing something. She said, "He stopped looking at the wall." I said, "What?" She said, "Everybody looks at the wall every lap. You come up, you find the wall, you know where you are." He stopped doing it. He came up and he looked at nothing. She shrugged. He was still swimming great. His body was great. He just wasn't in there anymore. Shallow water blackout. That's the term. It's what kills strong swimmers, and it kills them specifically because they're strong. You hyperventilate even a little, even without meaning to. It blows off your CO2, and CO2 is what makes you want to breathe, not oxygen, CO2. So now your oxygen is dropping and dropping, and the alarm bell that's supposed to ring doesn't ring. You feel fine. You feel good. And then you don't feel anything. There's no struggle. That's the thing that gets people killed. Everybody's watching for thrashing, for the arms, for the panic. Shallow water blackout doesn't do that. The lights just go out and you go quietly to the bottom of the pool like a dropped coin, and nobody notices for 90 seconds, and 90 seconds is enough. At minute 19, Toma Wexler pushed off the wall, swam about 11 feet and stopped. He didn't sink dramatically. He didn't spasm. He just got heavier. His shoulders rolled forward, and he settled face down in maybe 9 feet of green churning water, in a pool with 50 people in it and 2 instructors on the deck, and a colonel doing his own laps, and a medical professional with 24 years of experience standing in the doorway with a bag full of equipment. And every single one of us missed it. Every single one of us. Raina Salvig was already moving. She was in the water before he stopped. I've thought about that 1,000 times and I still don't fully believe it, but I saw it, and so did about 40 people, and it's in the incident report. She left the deck before he blacked out. She went off that edge while he was still swimming. She had already decided. 7 minutes earlier, standing there with her hands behind her back and 29 pieces of metal in her leg, she had already decided that she was going to be in that water when that kid went down. She just waited to be right. She hit the water flat, and she went across the top like something being pulled by a rope. No weight belt. That's the one advantage she had, and she used it. She was fast on the surface, faster than I'd ever seen her do anything on land, and she covered 40 feet in about 6 seconds, and then she went down. And she came up with him. She had him under the arms from behind, chin up, and she was on her back kicking with her left leg. And this is the detail that broke something in me: she was kicking with her left leg only. The right one was just trailing, useless, dead weight in the water. She dragged a 140-pound unconscious man 25 feet across a pool, using one leg and both arms, while 49 people were still swimming past her without knowing what was happening. And then Marchetti saw. He came up for air about 10 feet from her, and his head turned, and I watched him understand. He didn't shout. He went straight down, got the belt buckle, dumped 20 pounds on the bottom of the pool, and came up under Wexler's hips and lifted. And between the two of them, they got that kid to the wall in about 4 seconds. And that's when everything went loud. Somebody screamed. Somebody's whistle went. The 2 instructors on the deck hit the water simultaneously, and I was moving. I was already moving, bag in my hand, and I hit that deck sliding on my knees in a puddle, and I got there just as they rolled him out. Gray. I want you to hear that word. Not blue. People say blue. He was gray like wet newspaper, and his lips were the color of the inside of an oyster, and his eyes were half open, and there was nothing behind them at all. No pulse at the wrist. I put 2 fingers on his throat. Nothing. And then Raina Salvig came up out of the water beside me, and she said one word. Down. And I got out of the way. I got out of the way. 24 years. Senior medical professional on site. It was my scene, my patient, my legal responsibility. And this woman who was 32 days into a selection course said one word and I moved, and I have never once regretted it. Because I saw her hands. You can tell everything from hands. Everything. I've trained maybe 400 corpsmen, and I could tell you in 9 seconds which ones would be any good, and it was always the hands. Hers went down onto that kid's sternum and there was nothing in them. No hurry, no shake, no hesitation. They went where they were supposed to go, on the first try, without looking, the way your hand finds a light switch in your own house in the dark. And I thought, oh, she's done this more than I have. She did compressions. I did the airway. And Marchetti, Colonel Everett Marchetti, 48, dripping wet in a swimsuit on a concrete deck, knelt down at the boy's head and put his hand on the boy's forehead and held it there. And he said, right down into his ear, very quietly, "Come on, son." And then 3 seconds later, "Come on, son." And then again. The same 2 words, over and over. He must have said it 40 times. He wasn't shouting. He was just saying it close, right in his ear, like you'd talk to a dog you were trying to get out from under a porch. He can hear me. If I go quiet, he's alone. I looked up. Raina Solvig was doing compressions, counting under her breath, and she had heard him. And she was looking at the colonel. And the colonel was looking at nothing at all, staring at the wet concrete 4 inches from Wexler's face, saying, "Come on, son, come on, son," and he had no idea she was looking at him. I don't know what she saw. I know she started crying. Not sobbing, she never broke rhythm, not once. Her hands kept going up and down like a machine. But there was water running down her face, and it wasn't pool water, because pool water doesn't come out of the corners of somebody's eyes in a straight line. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, Toma Wexler vomited. That's how it happens. Not gasping. Not a big dramatic breath. He convulsed and he vomited a stomach full of pool water sideways across the concrete, and I turned his head and he breathed, ragged and wet and horrible, and it was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my life. His hand came up. It found the nearest thing, which was Raina's forearm. And it closed. And it did not let go. The ambulance took 11 minutes. He was awake for 8 of them, confused, terrified, asking the same 4 questions on a loop the way hypoxia victims do. And she stayed. She sat on that concrete deck in the cold with her leg out straight in front of her, and she let a 23-year-old kid hold her forearm with both hands like a child. And she answered the same 4 questions 11 times without one single change in her voice. Where am I? You're at the pool, you're okay. What happened? You went under, we got you. Am I out of the course? No. Where am I? You're at the pool, you're okay. The medics loaded him. And as they lifted the litter, Toma Wexler, gray, shaking, wrapped in 2 blankets, 23 years old, turned his head and looked for her. And he said, "Ma'am." She said, "Yeah." He said, "You didn't go quiet." I want you to understand that he had never read that file. He had no idea. He was a 23-year-old airman who had been unconscious for 2.5 minutes, and he was hypoxic and half his brain was still offline, and he did not know one single thing about 11 February. He said it because it was true. Because when he was down there in the dark at the bottom of that pool with the lights going out, somewhere in whatever part of him was still receiving, he had heard someone talking to him, and they had not stopped. She said no. And her voice broke, and it was the only time. And they took him away. Marchetti stood up. He'd been on his knees on that concrete for 15 minutes, and he was 48 years old, and it took him a moment. He put a hand on the wall. Then he turned around and looked at his class. 50 candidates, 49 now, standing in a pool with their weight belts on. Nobody had gotten out. Not one of them had climbed out of that water. They'd been treading for 15 minutes with 20 pounds on, and their arms were shaking, and every one of them was watching. He looked at them for a long time. And he said, "Get out of the water." They got out. And he said, "Evolution's over, everybody passed." And then he said, in a voice I had never once heard him use, in 3 years of working under that man, "I need to go make a phone call." I found him 40 minutes later on the seawall. Still in the swimsuit, still wet, sitting on the concrete with his feet hanging over the water and the wind coming in off the bay like a hand pushing on your chest, and it was maybe 44 degrees, and he'd been sitting there for 40 minutes with no shirt on. I put a blanket over his shoulders. He didn't say thank you. He said, "I called Landstuhl." I sat down next to him. He said, "There's a records office. Takes about 20 minutes to get a human being on the line. And the human being can't tell you anything, obviously, because it's all sealed, and I don't have the authority, and I told her that, and she said she was sorry." He was looking at the water. So I asked her a different question. I said, "I don't want the name. I don't want the unit. I don't want the location. I want to know one thing, and it's not classified because it's not in the file, it's in your building." He turned his head and looked at me. I said, "Is he still alive?" The wind came across the water, and neither of us said anything for a while. "She put me on hold for 11 minutes, he said, "and she came back." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "And she said yes." And I said, "Is he whole?" And she went quiet. And then she said, and Marchetti stopped, and he had to start again. She said, "Sir, he's got 2 prosthetic legs, and he coaches high school baseball in Ohio. And he has 3 kids, and the youngest one is named Raina." I put my hands over my face. Marchetti sat there on that seawall in a blanket in the cold, with his feet hanging over the Chesapeake, and he said, "Carlo, I made her explain her leg, in the rain, in front of 50 people." He said, "I made her explain her leg." And that's when he told me what he was going to do. And I told him not to. I told him it was a catastrophically bad idea, that it would end her career, that it was self-indulgent, that it was about him and not about her. And I said every single one of those things, and I have never been so completely and totally wrong about anything in my entire life. Because 6 days later, Colonel Everett Boyd Marchetti stood up in front of a board of admirals in Coronado. And he told them the truth. Coronado in March is a lie. That's the only word for it. You fly out of Norfolk in the horizontal rain, you get off a plane in San Diego, and there's a palm tree. There's sun. There are people jogging on the beach in shorts like the world is a reasonable place. And a mile down that same beach, there is a bell, and a boat crew, and a bunch of kids being taught that the world is not a reasonable place, and the tourists take pictures of them. I have always hated Coronado. I went because he asked me to. That's the truth. He came to the aid station on the Thursday, actually knocked on my door frame, which he had never done in 3 years, and he stood there and he said, "They're convening a board, Monday, I'd like you to be there." And I said, "As what, sir?" And he said, "As the only other person who was in the room. Here's what nobody understands about these things. There was no scandal. There was no news story. Nobody outside a very small building knew any of this happened, and nobody ever will, and if you go looking for it, you won't find it, and that's fine. That's how it should be. But there was a board. Because a candidate had gone unconscious in a pool and been resuscitated on the deck, and any time that happens, the entire evolution gets torn apart by people whose job is to figure out who screwed up. That's not cruelty. That's how you stop it happening again. That's the system working. And in the course of tearing it apart, Somebody was going to pull the medical file of every person who was in that pool house, including the one who wasn't in the pool. Marchetti knew that. That was the whole thing. That was the entire calculation he made on that seawall in a blanket. He knew that in about 4 working days, some very thorough lieutenant commander in Coronado was going to open candidate Solvig's medical record, find a clean bill of health signed by me, and then read the incident report describing a candidate with a non-functional right leg dragging a body across a pool. And that lieutenant commander was going to have 2 questions. Why is this woman's medical file clean? And who signed it? I could have gone down for that. I want to be honest with you. I could have. Falsification of a medical record, or at minimum a catastrophic failure of screening, and I had 19 years in and a pension 11 months away, and I have never in my life been so frightened of a piece of paper. Marchetti knew that too. He sat on that seawall and he did the math, and he understood that if he did nothing, the system would find the paperwork, and the paperwork would end me, and it would end her, and it would do it quietly in a room with no windows in about 6 weeks, and it would call it procedure. So he decided to get there first. The board sat at 900 Monday in a room on the 2nd floor of a building I'm not going to name. 4 officers, 3 admirals, one of them force medical, and a Marine brigadier general who I could tell within 90 seconds was the one who actually mattered. There was a court reporter. There was a table. There was a window with the blinds down and one of those water pitchers with the little beads of condensation running down it. And I remember watching a bead run all the way down and pool on the table, and thinking I am going to lose my job over that pool of water. Marchetti sat down. He didn't have notes. He didn't have a folder. He had nothing. The senior admiral said, "Colonel, this is an informal fact-finding. You're not accused of anything. We'd like you to walk us through the events of Wednesday." And Marchetti said, "With respect, sir, I'd like to start with Tuesday." There was a pause. The admiral looked at his notes. Tuesday isn't part of this inquiry. And Marchetti said, "It's going to be. I have never in my life watched a man walk toward a cliff on purpose. I have now." He told them. All of it, start to finish. In that flat, even, unbearable Marine voice, without one single softening word, without one excuse, without one "sir, I want to provide some context." He just laid it down on that table like a man emptying his pockets. He told them a candidate came to medical at 4:55 on Tuesday and requested a chit. He told them the chit was not granted, and that he had, and he used this exact phrase, "gone out of my way to confirm that it wasn't." He told them he assembled the class at the finish line of a 12-mile run and used that candidate as a teaching aid. He said, "I told 50 candidates that the mission does not care what bothers them. I used her as the example. I did it deliberately, and I did it in front of her peers, and I did it because I had formed a conclusion about her 11 days earlier, and I had been waiting for an opportunity to confirm it publicly." The court reporter's hands stopped for about half a second. I saw it half a second, then they started again. The force medical admiral said, "Colonel." And Marchetti kept going. He said, "I then required her to explain her medical condition to 50 people standing in the rain. She asked me if I wanted an explanation or a demonstration. I told her to demonstrate." He said, "She removed her boot." And then he told them what was under it. 29 pieces, the perineal nerve, the foot that doesn't lift. He described that leg to 4 flag officers in a bright room in California with the precision of a man reading a chart, and he did not stop, and he did not look away, and when he was done the room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning. The Marine general spoke for the first time. He said very quietly, "Where'd she get it?" And Marchetti said, "Sir, I can't tell you that, and neither can you." That landed. I watched a one-star general absorb the sentence, "Neither can you," and I watched him understand exactly what it meant. And I watched his jaw move once. He said, 11 February. Marchetti said, "Yes, sir." The general sat back in his chair. He said to nobody, "Oh, hell." And then the questions started. And they were the questions I had been dreading for 6 days. And they came exactly the way I knew they would. "Colonel, how did this candidate pass medical screening?" And Marchetti said, "She didn't lie, sir." "That's not what I asked." "I know it's not, sir." He put both hands flat on the table. "But it's the answer. She was asked about prior injuries. She said some. She said old ones healed. Every word she said was true, and every word she said was designed to be true and useless, and it worked because it was supposed to work, because she has spent." He stopped. And he said something I did not expect. He said, "Because she has spent her entire adult life being trained by us to do exactly that." Nobody said anything. He said, "We tell them the mission comes first. We tell them pain is information, not permission. We tell them from day one that the man who raises his hand is the man who lets his team down." He looked up. "She was the best student we ever had. She learned it perfectly. And then we put her in a room with a corpsman and a clipboard, and were shocked that she gave us the smallest true thing she could find. Colonel, the corpsman who signed that screening, Carlo. And that was me." And my chest went to ice. Marchetti said, "Yes, sir." 19 years at that command should have caught it. And I sat there in that chair with my hands folded, and I looked at the table and I waited. And Marchetti said, "Sir, H.M. Carlo saw a candidate who did not want to be examined, and drew the same conclusion any of us would have drawn, and that conclusion was wrong. It is a failure. It is her failure, and she'd tell you so herself, and she has told me so twice, without being asked." He let that sit. Then he said, "It is also a failure that happens 400 times a year in this Navy, and does not usually result in a board, because it does not usually involve a candidate with a sealed file and a silver star she has never once mentioned." The room went very still. The Force Medical Admiral said slowly, "She has a what?" And Marchetti said, "You'd have to ask her, sir. It's not in her personnel jacket, it's in the sealed one." He said, "She's never worn it." "Colonel," the senior admiral leaned forward, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Whose fault is Wednesday?" And this is it. This is the moment. Because the answer was sitting right there, gift-wrapped, and every officer in that room knew it. The answer was nobody's. Shallow water blackout is a known risk. Wexler hyperventilated. The safety protocols were followed. 2 instructors were on deck. Nobody did anything wrong on Wednesday, and if Marchetti had said, "Sir, it was an unforeseeable medical event," 4 flag officers would have nodded and written it down and gone to lunch. And there was a second answer which was even easier, and which was hers. She was medically unfit. She concealed it. She entered the water without authorization. She violated a direct order to remain on the deck. Any competent lawyer could have made that stick. Marchetti said, "Mine, sir." "Explain." And Marchetti said, "Because I put her on that deck." He said, "I ordered her not to swim, and then I ordered her to stand at the edge of that pool and watch 50 people go into the water. I did it because I had spent 48 hours realizing I had humiliated a woman who had done something I have never done and will never do, and I wanted." He stopped. He actually stopped, in front of 4 flag officers, and he had to breathe. "I wanted to give her something. I wanted to give her a job, because I couldn't apologize to her in a way that would have meant anything, and I knew it. And so I did the only thing I know how to do, which is I gave her a task." He looked at the table. And she did it. She did it perfectly. She stood at the edge of that pool for 19 minutes and she watched 50 people, and she found the one who was dying before he knew he was dying. He said, "Sir, you asked me whose fault Wednesday is." He looked up. "Toma Wexler is alive because I put a woman with a destroyed leg on the side of that pool. If I hadn't done it, he'd have been on the bottom for 90 seconds, and we'd be having a very different conversation in a room with his mother in it." He said, "So yes, sir, Wednesday is my fault." He said, "It is the only thing I have done in 5 weeks that I am not ashamed of, and I want it in the record that I did it by accident, because I was trying to make myself feel better." The court reporter had stopped typing. I watched her. She was maybe 26 and she had stopped, and she was staring at Marchetti, and then she caught herself and her hands went back down and she caught up. The Marine general said, "Colonel, what do you want?" And Marchetti said, "3 things, sir. 1. I want H.M. Carlo's screening failure entered as a systemic finding, not an individual one. She's got 19 years. She's the best I've ever worked with. And if we punish her for missing this, then every corpsman in this Navy learns that the safe move is to bounce anybody who won't drop trow on demand. And I'd like you to think for about 4 seconds about who that policy would actually filter out." The general said, "Noted." 2. I want the screening question changed. Say again. Sir, the form asks any prior injuries. That's the question. 4 words. He shook his head. It's a terrible question. It asks a warfighter to volunteer a reason to disqualify themselves. Nobody has ever answered that question honestly in the history of this Navy, and we all know it, and we keep printing the form. He said, "Change it. Ask them. What are you managing? Ask them. What would you be embarrassed to tell me? Ask them anything except a yes/no that we've spent their entire career training them to answer no." The Force Medical Admiral wrote something down. I want you to know that. He wrote something down, and I know for a fact because I filled out the new one in 2023 that the form changed. It changed. It's a small thing. It's 4 lines on a piece of paper. It's the only monument she'll ever get, and she doesn't know it exists. And the 3rd thing, Colonel. Marchetti was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 3rd, I want her out. I made a sound. I couldn't help it. I made an actual audible sound in that room, and every head turned, and I put my hand over my mouth, and the senior admiral looked at me for about 2 seconds and then, mercifully, looked away. Out of the course. Out of the course, sir. Out of the pipeline. Medically disqualified, effective immediately, full and permanent. I sat there in that chair, and I felt the bottom drop out of the world. Because that was it. That was the end of her. Everything she'd bled for, everything she'd hidden for, 34 years and 29 pieces of metal, and a man in Ohio with 3 kids. And he was doing it himself. The man who'd humiliated her in the rain was standing in a room in Coronado, personally putting the knife in. I have never hated anyone the way I hated him for about 11 seconds. The Marine general said, very slowly, "Colonel, you just spent 40 minutes telling us she's the finest operator you've ever seen." And Marchetti said, "Yes, sir. And now you want her disqualified." And Marchetti said, "Yes, sir." "Why?" And Colonel Everett Boyd Marchetti said, "Because she is going to die out there, sir, and she will do it on purpose, and she will do it well, and everyone will call it heroism." He said, "She's 34 years old. She has a nerve injury that shuts her foot off without warning. She refused a litter. She refused evacuation twice with metal in her while she was." He stopped. He said, "Sir, she does not have a survival instinct. It got removed. I don't know when and I don't know how, and I will never know because I'm not cleared to know." He said, "And this organization is very good at finding people like that and using them, and burying them with honors, and we tell ourselves that's a tragedy. He looked around the room. It isn't a tragedy. It's a harvest. And I've been doing it for 26 years. And on Tuesday morning, I stood in the rain and I made one of them take her boot off. And I would like. And his voice went finally. Right at the end. I would like, one time before I retire, to put one of them somewhere they can't be spent. Nobody spoke. The general said, "You understand she'll fight this." Marchetti said, "She'll fight it, sir. She'll fight it hard and she'll be right and she'll lose and she will never speak to me again for the rest of her life." He stood up. "I've made my peace with that. Sit down, Colonel." He sat down. The Marine general laced his fingers together and looked at him for a long, long moment. And then he said, "You're an idiot." Marchetti said, "Sir." And the general said, "There's a third option, and you're too busy hatting yourself to see it.